Good afternoon and welcome to our distinguished guest speakers this afternoon and our online audience. My name is Lorette Lobeseidnout and I'll be the facilitator for this webinar. I'm a consultant with the Helen Suzman Foundation. One of the founding principles of our mandate is the promotion of the rule of law. And over the years, the Foundation has pursued reform of the main body tasked with the appointment of judges, being the Judicial Service Commission, through various efforts like strategic litigation, public dialogue, research, and formal submissions. The HSF has long advocated for reform of the JSC's composition so as to limit political representation. Similarly, the Foundation and other civil society organizations like those participating today in this webinar have advocated for members of the JSC to be held to account and for there to be a mechanism for their removal. Recently, former Chief Justice Zondo, in delivering the Foundation's annual memorial lecture, highlighted the fact that the GNU might offer a rare opportunity to relook the composition of the JSC so as to avoid a hypothetical future where one governing party could, under the current composition of the JSC, capture the appointments to the judiciary. I am aware that in June 2025, last year, the Joint Constitutional Review Committee, which is the GNU, actually had an opportunity to grapple with this very issue as it was dealing with legacy submissions from the Sixth Parliament. And as chance would have it, the Helen Suzman Foundation submission on this very reform asking for a different composition under the constitutional amendment was discussed. It was launched in 2021, but only discussed by the GNU last year in June. And the committee decided not to proceed with this amendment. But be that as it may, it is against this background that we are hosting our webinar to bring together experts who have in the past commented on shortcomings in the composition and functioning of the JSC to discuss these two interrelated reform proposals. And it now gives me a pleasure to introduce our speakers for this webinar. We are very pleased to be joined by Ms. Alison Tilley. She is the coordinator of the Judges Matter campaign, which is an extensive campaign on judicial appointments and conduct processes. We are also delighted to be joined by Mr. Lawson Naidu. He is the Executive Secretary for the Council on the Advancement of the South African Constitution, known as CASAC, a position he has held since 2010. Mr. Lawson, of course, has a deep understanding of political, constitutional, and legal issues in our country. Finally, I would like to welcome Mr. Chris Oxtoby, who is an independent legal consultant. He currently works as a research consultant with Freedom Under the Law, where he focuses on issues of judicial appointments and conduct, constitutionalism, and the rule of law. I would now like to hand over to our speakers, who will each be given about 10 minutes to provide their inputs and thoughts on the topic of discussion. And thereafter, I will open up the platform on our YouTube channel to engage with our online audience. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Thank you very much for joining us. And may I ask Alison for your inputs? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to talk about this. There's so much to say that I may have difficulty keeping on topic, but I'll do my best. I mean, I think we all agree that judicial appointments are really important. They're important because judges are important. Judges shape the future of a constitutional democracy. Every major constitutional issue is ultimately going to depend on the quality and independence of judges. And that's why the JSC plays such a decisive constitutional role. But judicial independence doesn't depend only on judges, but also on the institution that recommends them. So coming back to the JSC, how do we make sure that the JSC commissioners do the best job possible, accepting that there's nothing perfect, but how do we make sure that the JSC end up being substantively suited to safeguarding judicial independence? I think the public confidence in the courts it's holding. I think it's still there, but I think we have to accept that there are high levels of concern around judicial appointments. I think there are levels of concern around the courts and the functioning of courts. I think people are concerned about, whether criminals are being prosecuted swiftly, and where they're found guilty, locked up. There's a lot of concern, and I think it's appropriate concern. I think we have to deal with it. The JSC interviews should be a mechanism for assessing judicial merit, and that's a vexed concept. So perhaps not as easy as you might think. We've been monitoring JSC interviews over several years, and I think we found that there are challenges which recur, and one of them would be inconsistent questioning. There would be uneven testing of various competences. There has been politicized questioning. There has been what I suppose you could call performative questioning, where people are perhaps not actually speaking to the room, but speaking to a constituency outside of the JSC. And I think there's also this question of whether the constitutional criteria are adhered to. We know that even if there are good appointments, and of course there have been many, many good appointments, that doesn't compensate for the fact that the process can be weak. And I think what worries me is that if the JSC lacks credibility, then I think that the same can then apply to judges, and then judicial independence is weakened and the rule of law. So I mean, I hope I'm not exaggerating the concerns, but I really think that they are there, and they have to be, they have to be met. The JSC is made up of people from different parts of the legal profession, and from members of parliament. That representation, I think, really helps. I think it does provide legitimacy for the JSC. Those commissioners are exercising significant power, but their role isn't a political one. Their role should be one in which they are looking to safeguard the institution of the judiciary and the Constitution. I think one of the things we focused on is really the question of appointment criteria, because I think that's something that has been more and less clear. I think much more clear recently, where they've adopted appointment criteria, and we're able to really assess candidates, or they are able to assess candidates in relation to the criteria. But I think we're not only able to assess the candidates, we're able to assess the commission itself. What we are trying to do at Judges Matter is look at a scorecard to systematically observe interviews. This isn't ranking candidates or challenging appointments, but trying to figure out whether the process is getting better at focusing on good questions, and you've got to make a call as to what a good question is, and we think, well, the questions should go to the criteria. So you should be asking questions that relate to what it is we want to see in candidates. So we're trying to find a way to really be consistent and fair in assessing, what is actually happening. I think what we can see is that there is more consistency, I would say. But I would also say that there is really only a focus on the most basic of the elements of the criteria. So there's a focus on the CV of the candidate. What is their training? What is their background? Where did they study? And that is something that is generally led at the moment in this JSC by the Chief Justice. And she will make sure that the candidate has an opportunity to speak to that. But that takes up quite a lot of time in the interview. So the bit that's unconscious, which is, how long have you been an advocate, and, as an attorney, when did you qualify, whatever the issue is, that's the sort of easier part of the process. But it doesn't, in fact, then allow for most of the interview to focus on the candidate and how they meet the criteria. And I think the question of what to ask about is also something that we're really going to have to look at, because it is itself tricky. I mean, there's no vetting of candidates. You hire somebody to work in your organization, and let's say that they work with money. I mean, you would do a credit check, and you wouldn't really think twice about it. But there's no ability on the part of the JSC to do something similar. So I think that affects the questioning. Of course, people write into the JSC and raise concerns, and that can then work its way through to the questioning. So maybe that remedies that problem to some extent. I think one of the things that we consistently come back to is this question of being an acting judge. I think it's generally thought that if the more acting you've done, the better. Somebody did recently say to me, are you sure? Because it may be that the more acting that you can do, it means the less busy your practice, in which case you actually may have less experience than somebody who has lesser acting experience. So, that's a wrinkle I haven't quite managed to work out how we deal with, but I take that on board, that, while we do look at acting, it may not be quite what we think it is. I mean, why does all of this matter? I think to come back to what I said, I think that the judicial appointments process has to be fair. I think that legitimacy in the interviewing process is something that legitimizes the structure, the institution of the judiciary. Now, the question about what to do about it, I mean, the things that we've been working on is, as I said, the criteria for appointment, making those explicit, trying to figure out whether those are actually the issues around which questioning happens. There's the question of accountability mechanisms, where the commissioner's conduct undermines the process. It's probably a double-edged sword, because the thing is that if you can focus on commissioners, that might end up being, an opportunity for internecine warfare, where, commissioners are then accusing each other of improper conduct. So I'm not sure about that. There are, of course, the suggestions around the members of parliament. I have to say, my view has always been that the members of parliament are not the only politicians in the room. There often are politics at play, whether they're the legal profession or party politics amongst the other commissioners. How does one deal with that? I think coming back to a code of conduct for commissioners, that may be of some assistance. But I think it really is important to strengthen the JSC. in order to strengthen and continue to strengthen the judiciary. And I think we have to recognize that that appointments process has to command public confidence. So the fact that, people who are watching the JSC closely may say that this year was better than last year, that was better than the year before, well, yes, but I think a lot of people who are not observing that closely are concerned and have been concerned, and their concerns are not being allayed by the way the JSC is functioning now. So I think those are my just some of the issues that I think we're thinking about around the JSC, and I really, I welcome this webinar. I think it's timely and an important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those inputs. I mean, from an organization that deals with this daily, it's really useful to hear other sides of arguments, especially, say, around the issue of maybe not holding commissioners to account and what that could unlock amongst commissioners themselves. It's something I haven't thought about. But I'd now like to call on our next speaker, Lawson, please, for your inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion today. I think Alison's covered a lot of to speak about, but so I won't repeat that. But simply to emphasize the point that judicial appointments are important. Judicial integrity is important, and they're important because the rule of law is the very foundation of our constitutional democracy. So one cannot overstate the importance of a discussion like this. So I'm going to try and focus just on a couple of aspects of the issues that we're dealing with today. One being the composition of the JSC, and the other being around accountability mechanisms, which has been touched upon already. So when it comes to the composition, the JSC is a large body. It's 23 people. It becomes 25 when you're dealing with certain issues relating to provinces. One can, when you look at the composition, you can see the mix between the three arms of the state: the executive, the judiciary itself, and the legislature. And the issue is around the balance between those. So, on a very simple basis, one can say, well, there are 11 politicians at least, and I totally agree with what Alison said about it's not just the politicians who bring the politics into the room, but you've got the 10 members, 6 from the National Assembly, 4 from the provinces, as well as the Minister of Justice. And then you have the 4 discretionary appointments that the president is entitled to appoint 4 people. There's very little guidance in the Constitution as to who they ought to be. Currently, there are 4 practicing lawyers. I think it's 2 advocates and 2 attorneys. And all the president has to do is to consult leaders of political parties in the National Assembly before making those appointments. So the one issue is around the size of the JSC as a whole. Is it too large to function optimally? That's a question. Secondly, it's the balance between the different sectors that are represented there. And the one point I would want to make is that if we are looking at the issue of the composition of the JSC, one category of people I think we need to bring into the conversation are retired judges. Now, one can understand that when this constitution was written in 1996, we didn't have a serious cohort of judges who were aligned with the values and principles of the Constitution itself, which is critical in judicial appointments. But 30-odd years later, we now have a cohort of experienced, very, very good retired judges who are still capable of playing a role. And I would suggest that when we look at the issue of reforming or changing the composition of the JSC itself, we should look at judges in that regard. The next issue is around the accountability of judges, the accountability of commissioners. Sorry, before saying that, I mean, I think the issue of a code of conduct for commissioners is absolutely critical. As Alison has said already, the introduction of some sort of criteria for judges for the JSC has certainly helped in terms of the types of questioning that is being put to candidates that are there. In the past, we saw very much a rather than giving them an opportunity to showcase why positively they should be appointed, including attacks on the integrity of various candidates. But the code of conduct would be a starting point in this regard, and I don't think it will be the silver bullet that we require. I think leadership matters to a large extent in this way, or in this regard, and the manner in which the Chief Justice, in this current period, Chief Justice Meyer, leads the JSC is going to be of critical importance. She needs to provide the ethical leadership and the overall direction of the JSC that enables it to properly execute its constitutional mandate, which is to appoint judges that would add to the credibility of the judicial system, taking into account all of the factors that are included in the Constitution, including the demographic representativity, which remains critical if the judiciary is to be seen as a credible body that reflects South African society. But the issue around the accountability of commissioners is an important one, because there are different appointing bodies. A lot of the appointments are made by the president, including the appointment of the representatives of the legal profession. Although nominated by legal bodies, the appointments are made by the president, and therefore to whom are those commissioners accountable? If one looks perhaps just specifically at the 10 commissioners that are appointed by Parliament, by both the houses, to what extent are they accountable to Parliament as commissioners on the Judicial Service Commission? They're representing the institution of Parliament and not necessarily the interests of their political parties, although the Constitution is very clear in that at least 3 of the members nominated from the National Assembly must be members of opposition parties. That now opens up a whole new can of worms in relation to the GNU and what constitutes an opposition party. But there's no formal mechanism whereby Parliament can hold those commissioners accountable. And there's no real sense in any case appointing bodies as a whole, be it Parliament, the legal profession, law teachers and so on, exercise any oversight over the performance of their nominees at the JSC. Do they review the performance of their nominees there? Do they hold them accountable? And if they fall short of the standards that are expected of them, what action is taken? Well, from experience, I think we can see that there's very little action. And, I just want to use one example in which CASEC was involved, where we laid a complaint with Parliament's Ethics Committee about the conduct of Mr. Julius Malema during one set of JSC interviews a few years ago, where he attacked a candidate who was a judge who had ruled in a case involving Mr. Malema's political party, the EFF, and attacked the integrity of the judge in his questioning. We then laid a complaint with Parliament's Ethics Committee, which went through the process, and ultimately was the committee and then the National Assembly endorsed their recommendation that Mr. Malema should be directed to apologize to the judge in question. That matter was then taken up in the courts, and I think it's still pending an appeal or a possible appeal. But the apology has still not been forthcoming, and several years later, the issue is not resolved. But we were able to utilize a mechanism to say to Parliament, Mr. Malema or any other MP representing the institution of Parliament must be accountable to you as the body that has appointed them. So there are mechanisms that can be utilized, but I think a code of conduct for commissioners would certainly help in that regard to deal with some of the issues around to whom are the commissioners accountable, what sort of role does the chief, overall authority over the JSC, and perhaps just to round off, to say that I think transparency in the judicial appointment system as a whole is critically important. And whilst there are now guidelines and criteria for what the JSC should be or ought to be looking for, the skills and competencies in candidates, and we see that play out in the public interviews, televised and broadcast, but we have no idea to what extent those criteria are actually considered when the JSC goes behind closed doors after the interview process is concluded and deliberates as to which judges it is going to recommend for appointment. Anecdotally, we see all we are left with is the fact that there is the JSC commissioners vote. Whether the criteria play any role in the way those deliberations are conducted and the way that votes are cast is something that we don't know, and that's perhaps another area that we need to look at in terms of reform. So let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those inputs. Just maybe from our side, we actually wrote to Parliament, to the Speaker recently, and on a number of issues around substantive suitability of candidates nominated by that institution. And in a response, we did highlight the fact that the Ethics Committee's decision has not been implemented against the honourable member. And it's true that the court actually threw out the case 9 months ago, and Parliament confirmed to us that they will now be acting against that member in this first term in 2026. So the apology should be coming forth now because there's no appeal process. But I'd now like to move on to Chris for your inputs, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorette, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks to the Helen Suzman Foundation for the opportunity to be here. I want to try and respond quite directly to the two components of our brief. First, on the question of the JSC's composition, and secondly, on the question of the accountability of its members. And then just to make a concluding point that goes a little bit beyond that, but is, I think, related to it. On the question of composition, I do think there is merit in having what I will loosely call politicians, referring largely to the members of the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, on the JSC for reasons of legitimacy, as Alison mentioned. I think as a counter to the concerns about the counter-majoritarian dilemma, the power of courts to overturn decisions of a democratically elected parliament. And I think one should perhaps have a small caution about removing too much political involvement in the process of appointing judges, because does that create a situation where you have a backlash against the judiciary, where politicians feel that their decisions are constantly being overturned by the courts, but yet they have no say in who is sitting on the courts. I think one should tread a little bit carefully in that regard. I think as my fellow panelists have touched on, the underlying assumption that is sometimes there that the representation of politicians is automatically problematic is more nuanced. I think there are unquestionably instances in the JSC's history where some of the political representatives on the Commission have indeed acted problematically and have confirmed a lot of those concerns about the agendas that they may be bringing to that role. But I think it also has to be acknowledged that there are those who have played a positive role and have been the kind of voices that I think the constitutional drafters had in mind, namely presenting a broader perspective, interrogating broader issues in candidates' outlook on the law than merely their technical legal expertise, which is, of course, in itself extremely important. And as the other speakers have already mentioned, of course, lawyers and judges are also quite capable of acting problematically and playing their own politics. In fact, Kasak's litigation in 2021 challenging a round of constitutional court interviews were a good example of that, where the lines of questioning that were highlighted in the review, some came from one politician in particular, but several came, unfortunately, from the then Chief Justice. So I think that those nuances and those subtleties are very important when we're discussing questions of the makeup and the composition. I think there are crucial questions that, regardless of who sits on the JSC, certain things need to be put in place, need to be covered. The question of clear criteria, which Alison touched on, is very much one. The question of ensuring those criteria are properly followed, Lawson raised that point, and that's also crucially important. And in fact, Freedom Under Law has ongoing litigation with the JSC on that point, so I won't say too much more about it, except to say that this relates to a further aspect of the JSC's functioning, which is that its voting process seems to me to need to be fixed. That is part of the subject matter of that litigation. And just to illustrate this, we've had 2 rounds of interviews for the Supreme Court of Appeal in recent years, where the JSC has not been able to fill all the vacancies, despite the presence of some seemingly eminently suitable candidates who would have met the Section 1742 transformation requirements in many cases, and yet the JSC has simply not filled vacancies. So I think that is something that strongly needs to be addressed. And my sense is that if questions of criteria, of voting process, and some other issues which I'll touch on could be addressed, that perhaps some of the concerns about the composition of the Commission may be mitigated just by making its internal processes work better and more effectively. Having said that, I do think there are undeniably concerns with the JSC structure. I think often one of the downsides with the role of politicians on the Commission is that I'm not sure that they always fully appreciate the role of judges, the particular nature of the judicial role and what goes into it. And so many of the questions that are put to candidates tend to be from their particular framework, questions that seem to expect judges to act in a manner more like politicians, to go out and hold surgeries and consult with affected groups, which don't seem to me to be at all realistic in light of the judicial role. How we deal with that? There was a move recently by the JSC to run an orientation program for new commissioners, which sounds like a promising idea, although one immediately would ask questions about, well, who is doing the orientation? What exactly is the content of what the commissioners are being orientated in? Bearing in mind the number of times the JSC has been overturned in the courts for its conduct, one would want to be quite careful of what new commissioners are being told. And I think, again, the question of criteria and the question of strict and effective chairing to counter this issue of, for example, what Alison referred to as the performative questioning, I think are really, really important. And I think we do have to acknowledge that in the composition of the JSC, there is an inherent tension in balancing the desire to get a slightly broader perspective than just the lawyers and just the judges, not to be focusing only on technical legal skills. And that is possibly something that unavoidably is going to lead to commissioners erring on one side. But But having said which, that's not to say that we should not be focusing very much on technical skills and competences. And I think that the JSC has certainly been guilty on many occasions in the past of not paying enough attention to that. Lastly, Lawson raised this question about just the size of the JSC. And I do think there is a strong argument to be made that the JSC is simply too big, just in terms of allowing it to function practically. Alison also mentioned the question of introductory questions taking a long time, then other commissioners coming in to ask questions. You'll often see interviews that run significantly over allocated, the time allocated to them. This can start causing a lot of problems where the schedule falls out completely, interviews run hours and hours over time. Now, that's often creates an unfair effect on the candidates. That's not solely an effect of the size of the commission. It also does relate to questions of criteria, to questions of chairing. But I do think there is an argument to be made that having a slightly smaller commission might at least help it to be more focused and more concise in how it does its job. To just give two comparative examples, the Kenyan JSC has 11 members, the Tanzanian JSC has 6. We have 23 going on 25. Does it really need to be that large? Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you cull out all the politicians. It may be a case that just each constituency has to be reduced slightly. But I think in the course of talking about reform, that is something that we need to consider. On the question of the code of conduct for members of the JSC, I very much agree that that is something that should be looked at. The ethics committee finding I was going to speak to, but Lawson's covered that. So I'd agree that this is an example of a case where arguably the designating body should have acted sooner and did not. And there are some instances where, for example, the president has replaced commissioners that he designates, but there also seems to be a general unwillingness from the organizations that designate members to the JSC to then act when there may be cause to do so when that commissioner has misconducted themselves. I think exactly how how a code of conduct and how the enforcement of it works would need a bit of unpacking and developing. The Constitution obviously provides for who gets to designate members of the JSC, so one would just have to be careful that you didn't have a situation where the JSC itself was effectively countermanding those designations. So exactly what and how the consequences for breach of a code of conduct would work is something I think that would need to be given some thought. One thought that occurs to me is another example from other jurisdictions which have an ombud in place specifically for organizations like the JSC. So whilst I'm loath to suggest that we create more bodies and more structures, that is possibly an approach that is worth giving some thought to see whether that could be a way of dealing with some of the problems that come up in the process without having to revert to judicial review. And again, in closing on this point, just to very much agree with Lawson about the importance of leadership and chairing. And I think some of the most egregious examples where JSC interviews have gone wrong has been where the chair has not been firmly in control of the process, or indeed, in some instances, even has been part of the problem with some of the questions asked. My very concluding remark, this is just to stray a little bit outside our brief, but I do think in talking about JSC reform and issues that need to be looked at, we do need to think about dealing with allegations of misconduct against judges. We currently have two sitting judges facing criminal charges. We have 2 more judges who are before Parliament to consider their potential removal from office, and other quite serious allegations against other judges are still floating around lower in the conduct system. I think that invites 2 considerations. Firstly, serious thought being given to looking at whether the JSC's process of dealing with those kind of complaints is fit for purpose or can be improved. And secondly, to look at how, if at all, the appointment system can be improved to try and ensure that you do not get ethically compromised, shall we say, candidates being appointed in the first place. And that may well involve looking quite seriously at greater capacitation of the JSC Secretariat. As Alison mentioned, vetting pretty much does not happen from the JSC side at all, but is very much reliant on submissions from the public. And my worry is that this large number of serious misconduct allegations that we see at the moment indicate that perhaps the appointment system is not adequate in weeding out potentially problematic candidates, which again is not to say that will inevitably be things that can be picked up at the appointment process, but it's possible that they might, and we certainly need to do our best to try and make sure that they are. So that's my several cents worth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My system has decided to turn off my internal camera. It gave a message and I have no idea how to turn that on. I do not have control over that unless I Google it, which I don't know how to do while I'm on the system. As long as you can hear me, I think that's good. Thank you very much for these last comments on the misconduct as well. We will definitely also take that forward in the foundation amongst the rule of law projects we're looking at. I was also wondering, I know CASIC's been doing work around how do we shortlist judges for the positions, because shortlisting and what criteria goes into it and who sits in that committee for shortlisting, how that feeds into the whole process as to who actually appears. And that for me links to another concern I've had around acting judges. It's easy to become an acting judge relatively, and yet when those acting judges come for interviews, the shortcomings in some of them are shocking if you look at the CVs sometimes and the kind of judgments handed down, and yet they were allowed to act in very busy and very in jurisdictions that have quite a large impact. And I was just wondering about the control around appointing acting judges and the impact that has down the line. But that is maybe for another forum. For this forum and our specific topic, I just had two last questions I would like to pose to the panel to respond to. And the one was around the issue of, it's fine that members are being nominated by the bodies stipulated in the Constitution, as long as they meet the limited criteria of belonging to those bodies. But has there been a development since the Hlophe judgment to maybe look at the substantive suitability of members? And then that would make them no longer suitable to sit on the JSC should they be found that their actions either within the commission imposing questions or what they do as individuals outside but still carrying the mandate of being nominated as a commissioner is attacking the judiciary or the magistracy to the extent that it erodes public confidence in the judiciary and the impact that has. Is that something that should be looked at in the code of conduct maybe, and the removal? My issue was also, my second question was just, so the one was that issue of should there be criteria for these bodies nominating members to say, look, we can no longer just say functionally you meet the criteria to be appointed to the JSC, you must also be substantively suited. And secondly, in 2022, there was actually a petition to the JSC from a number of organizations that raised the issue of the code of conduct with the JSC. What was the JSC's response to that? For you that have dealt with it, maybe Alison, over the years, is the JSC receptive to a code of conduct themselves? And why, if it's been raised in such a public manner with so many organizations in 2022, is there not even a public draft, or is there a draft maybe that's just not in the public domain? Is it on the agenda of the JSC when they meet? Those are my two closing questions from my side for this forum. Thank you very much for your input so far. I would ask each participant speaker, starting with Alison, just to give your thoughts maybe around these issues I've raised or any closing remarks you would like to make. Thank you, Alison.
Well, let me just come back to the code of conduct. I think what we have seen is that the JSC in the last couple of years is certainly reflecting on their own process and thinking about how to improve it. So the question of adopting criteria is one. The JSC have looked at the form that you fill in, when you're nominated, and compared it with what happens in the Magistrates Commission, and those interviews, and the form was altered. I think when the initial research that Zikona and Leba and I did, looking at the standard around, particularly around the length of time of interviews, I think that was quite influential, if I may say that, in getting them to tighten up. So I think if you have to say, where is the door part of the way open or open, I think the JSC itself is an interesting place. And you know, I think certainly much more susceptible to thinking about these issues than Parliament. I mean, if we just have to reflect on the amount of time the Justice Committee has been able to spend doing Justice Committee things, you know, they've been dealing with the ad hoc committee. It's maybe an unusually bad patch, but there really is, you know, very, very little time being spent on these issues at the moment. Constitutional amendment is obviously next level difficult. So then that would not be ordinary legislation being amended. So if I had to say where I think the opportunity is to support the JSC and its functioning, I think it's directly with the JSC itself. The JSC isn't an institution. It's not it's a group of people representing a whole lot of different interests. So it's not like an organization that has processes in the same way that a company would, or an oversight body, a Chapter 9 institution. So it's very much its own thing. And I think that actually provides an opportunity, because the thing is, once you've persuaded some of the constituent members of the JSC of the necessity of something, you know, the members of the JSC are not shy people. They are top-notch silks. They are, you know, people who head up organizations. They are, in some cases, very senior politicians. They are prepared to push for a reform agenda if they think it's warranted. So the solution to some of these things might lie in the JSC itself, but there are many issues, and trying to tackle them all at once is not sensible. So I think we do have to prioritize if we can. So and you know, amongst the organizations who focus on these issues, it would be nice if we could get, you know, agreement around what some of the most important issues are. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I agree. And I think that's why we're also meeting today, is to try and see where we could come in as a foundation and to work together on some of the most burning issues, and that we're all on the same page in a sense. Lawson, thank you. Some last comments from your side?
Thank you. Yeah, so briefly, I mean, I think, you know, the fact that there's no vetting of candidates should be a cause for great concern for all of us. I mean, in most public positions in the state, there is a level of vetting, and normally quite a high level of vetting that is conducted before people are appointed, as I say, to public positions. The fact that it's not happening here, I think, is a demonstrable weakness of the judicial appointment process. And that you know, that feeds directly into the question you asked about shortlisting again. Because, you know, you need to have your vetting process, you need to have certain minimum criteria by which you shortlist candidates for interview. I mean, we've seen examples where people have come before the JSC and, you are 2 minutes into the interview, you ask yourself, why is this person there? Because there's no credible shortlisting process that takes place. The other point I want to make now is around, the criteria for appointment of commissioners themselves. And, I think, it's quite clear that, commitment to constitutional values, impartiality and integrity, understanding of the importance of the judiciary as an arm of the state, non-partisanship, and so on. But I think when we're looking specifically at members of parliament, we shouldn't necessarily be looking at people who have legal qualifications or legal background. That's covered amongst the other categories of commissioners that we have. So you want representatives from parliament, and the reason, and that, for me, that's the reason they're there, is to give legitimacy to this process, that all societal considerations are taken into account. So people that have a much broader understanding of the justice system as a whole, as the importance of the rule of law for South Africans, issues around access to justice, all those sorts of things that people who are members of parliament can bring to the commission, not just pigeonholing them into needing to have legal skills. I think that's adequately covered elsewhere. Which perhaps brings me on to my final point that I want to make this afternoon, which is around the 4 presidential nominees. And I made the point earlier that currently all 4 of them are practicing lawyers, either advocates or attorneys. And perhaps, this is something that the president would need to take up, and I don't think one should in the constitution be prescriptive about how the president exercises that discretion. But certainly I think, the president ought to look more broadly than just at the legal profession, because it falls into that trap in terms of parliament that I've just mentioned. And perhaps the president should be looking much more broadly at broader civil society, at issues of representation from trade unions and the like, which would give it a broader focus and perhaps more legitimacy. So perhaps that's just my parting shot.
Thank you very much for those inputs. And Chris, if I can ask some last comments from your side. I'm so sorry for this dark screen of mine.
No problem. Thank you. So just to respond to a couple of the questions on the issue of substantive suitability and the impact of the Hlophe judgment, you'll note that despite doing work for Freedom Under Law and Freedom Under Law being one of the parties to that litigation, I managed to resist mentioning that case until now. But yeah, I mean, the judgment is quite clear that designating bodies will have to take substantive suitability into account. And Lorette, you mentioned the question of attacking the judiciary, and that was one of the specific issues that was at play in this case, where the former judge in question had launched a series of such attacks. So that very much is as it stands. That is the law. I don't know exactly where where any appeal process might land in that, but the High Court judgment, I think, is quite clear that substantive suitability does have to be considered. Obviously, there were particular and unique circumstances around Hlophe himself that may not be repeated in other cases, but the principle does hold. And I do think an interesting litmus test of the suitability question is going to be when the proceedings against Mr. Malema relating to the firearms discharge, which I understand sentencing is still pending. What happens as that process runs its course, and what Parliament will then do with that outcome, even if we do not see a conviction that automatically triggers the exclusion from Parliament and therefore from the JSC. I think that on the face of it would raise some quite fundamental suitability questions. So I think that's a very important question to watch. On the JSC's engagement on the code of conduct, I mean, Alison would have been closer to that process than I was, but my recollection was that it was taken under advisement and it was being considered, and it maybe still is being considered at some level. And I think that makes the point that, look, advocating to the JSC to make changes does take time. but it can in the long run be successful. When I've been watching the JSC since 2009, and many organizations have been advocating for the greater development of criteria from that time onwards. It took over a decade, but we are now at a point where the JSC has developed what I think are some very good, on paper at least, criteria. So we just have to keep, I think, fighting the long battle on that front. And I do agree with Alison's point. The JSC is reflective. I think this, in its current composition, this JSC is probably more open than most, if not all, of the previous incarnations that I've come across, in terms of taking inputs from civil society on board. And then just lastly on Lawson's point about the president looking more broadly at those four. Lawson, I'd actually been thinking to myself as you were talking, that would be a great way to get in some retired judges, but you wanted to go the other way and look beyond the legal profession, which is also a legitimate point. And of course, in previous years, we have seen, for example, trade unionists fill that position. So there's definitely plenty of scope for further advocacy and engagement with the JSC going forward.
Thank you very much for your inputs. I would like to end off by thanking you all for your time and preparation time and availability to engage with us today, because I think part of what we can do is to highlight the issues, like you said, the lobbying of the JSC. Maybe this is one element of doing it, is by having discussions and sharing it widely within our interest groups, to make people aware of the issues out there and to see how to get on board and to follow the interviews at the JSC and to follow the processes unfolding in Parliament and elsewhere around the suitability of candidates that represent us in these bodies. Thank you very much again for your time and for joining us. And I'm so sorry, finally, again, for my screen. Thank you.